For decades, we've been looking up, right, to the stars, searching for answers about UFOs. Who are they? Where are they from? But what if the answer isn't out there in deep space, but buried deep in our own past? Today, we're diving into a fascinating viewpoint that connects modern flying saucers to, believe it or not, fallen angels and an ancient spiritual war. So let's peel back the layers on what could be an incredibly ancient deception.
Okay, first things first. Believing in UFOs, that's not some fringe idea anymore, not at all. I mean, according to the polls cited in our source material, a whopping 57% of Americans are convinced they're real. We're talking about a clear majority here. This whole question has absolutely gone mainstream. And really, it's no wonder, especially when you look at famous incidents like Roswell back in '47. Now, the official story was just a weather balloon, right? But the analysis we're looking at points to a digitally enhanced photo of a general's memo from the scene. And the text it supposedly revealed? Well, it suggests something way, way more dramatic was being covered up. And this right here, this is the pivot point for our whole explainer. This theory is asking us to just set aside the science fiction story of little green men for a minute and consider a much older, more terrestrial, and frankly, spiritual explanation for all these phenomena.
So, before we can even start to look back into the ancient past, the argument being made is that we first need to get a real handle on the sheer scale of the modern UFO mystery itself. I mean, we're talking about everything from the famous Phoenix lights witnessed by literally thousands of people to fighter jets being scrambled over Washington, D.C. in the 50s. And it's not just regular folks. There are credible reports from decorated astronauts, guys on the Gemini and Apollo missions. This viewpoint pulls together a really compelling pattern of high-level sightings that are, well, they're pretty hard to just dismiss. Okay, so we've established the modern mystery. Now, this interpretation asks us to look for clues, not in some secret government hangar, but in ancient scripture. So the theory we're exploring today suggests that the rise of UFOs isn't some random thing. Instead, it's seen as the fulfillment of a very specific prophetic theme, popping up right alongside other predicted events like the rise of global governments and a one-world religion. This verse is presented as the key, the central clue to the whole puzzle. The argument is simple. If we want to understand what's happening now and what's coming next, we first have to understand exactly what was going on back in the days of Noah. And that investigation, digging into what the days of Noah were actually like, brings us to the central characters of this entire theory, a mysterious group known as the Nephilim. Now, the word itself, Nephilim, it comes from the Hebrew root nephal, and according to this research, it doesn't just mean giants, which is how it's often translated. The source says it more specifically means the fallen ones, and that distinction, it's absolutely critical to this whole idea. Okay, and this is where things get really interesting. The source material makes a crucial distinction that you have to understand for the rest of this to make sense. It says that fallen angels and demons, they are not the same thing. Nope. The argument is that the fallen angels were the original sons of God who fell. The demons? Well, according to this theory, they're the disembodied spirits of their hybrid offspring, the Nephilim, after they were killed. Two totally different entities. And according to texts like the Book of Enoch, which this theory relies on pretty heavily, this whole interaction was more than just physical. It was a transfer of forbidden knowledge. Things like weaponry, enchantments, astrology, knowledge that, according to the text, rapidly corrupted human society and led it completely astray. So you have to ask, why? Why would this happen? Well, the argument presented here is that this was no random event. It was a targeted, strategic attack on the human bloodline itself, a war over genealogy. This timeline really lays out the whole argument. This viewpoint suggests that the Nephilim in Genesis 6 were just the first move in a long, long spiritual war to corrupt the human lineage, the specific lineage from which a prophesied Messiah was supposed to come. The goal was to contaminate human DNA right at the source. And this, well, this brings us to some of the most difficult, challenging passages in the Old Testament. Through the lens of this theory, the suggestion is that those commands to utterly destroy certain tribes in Canaan, they weren't about a genocide against humans. The argument is that it was about eradicating a corrupted, non-human Nephilim gene pool. And look, this analysis points out that these weren't just a few isolated groups. It identifies numerous so-called giant tribes with names like the Rephaim, the Anakim, and the Emim. The idea is that the land of Canaan was intentionally repopulated with these bloodlines after the flood, specifically to block the path of the Israelites. So, the big question, how does any of this connect back to UFOs buzzing around our skies today? This is where the theory pulls it all together and presents its final and most startling conclusion. Get this, an estimate cited by the source suggests that 2% of the US population, that's as many as 6 million people, report having been abducted. And what's the common thread in so many of these abduction stories? A weird focus on reproductive organs and genetic procedures. Reported occupants of these craft also tend to fall into these distinct categories: the Greys, human-like beings, and so on. And this is where another fascinating connection is made, right back to the Book of Enoch, which says the spirits of the fallen would be assuming many different forms to defile and mislead humanity. And that brings us to the core thesis. This viewpoint proposes that the entire alien story, the whole narrative, is what the Bible calls the lie, a strong delusion sent in the last days. It suggests it's not an invasion from another planet, but a deception from another dimension, a grand replay of the genetic corruption from the days of Noah. So, the theory leaves us with this final, very provocative question. It completely reframes the entire debate, doesn't it? It asks us to look past the nuts and bolts of the spacecraft and to seriously consider whether what we're witnessing is actually an ancient spiritual deception, a battle not for our planet but for our very souls.